Good evening and welcome back to Kyle Hooten Live, presented by Alpha News. As always, I am your host. Tonight we are joined by A.J. Kaufman. If you're an avid Alpha News reader, you definitely recognize the name from the byline. A.J. is a senior columnist at Alpha News. He's also a published author of 3 books and has bylines all across Minnesota for his commentary and reporting. A.J., thanks so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into tonight's discussion.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I've been writing for Alpha News for almost a year and a half now, writing on a variety of topics, not just local, but international, national news, foreign policy, cultural issues. I have written 3 books. Yeah, you mentioned that. I've got one here. Here it is.
There
Reclamation. I was a public school teacher after college for four and a half, almost 5 years in Los Angeles. And it was kind of a harrowing experience dealing with the teachers' unions. And I started writing about that. That's where my writing experience began, probably when I was about your age, and had a lot of newspaper editorials, and eventually turned them into a book that came out in 2009, I believe. So after that, left the coast, moved to the Midwest, and eventually wound up here in Minnesota about 9 years ago. And I've done all kinds of different writing, and also worked as a historian, and happy to be here and happy to discuss the mission of Alpha News, my writing, and just talk about the country a little bit.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So you left West Coast California and came to Midwest California, settling in Minnesota. Why'd you do that?
Not directly. Actually started in DC, so would that be East Coast California?
Yeah.
And then went to Red State America, lived about 4 or 5 years in Indiana, and then briefly in Deep Red, the heartland in Nebraska, but in a blue city in Nebraska, in Lincoln. And now in Minnesota, a very blue state, but I live in a more red portion of the state. So whether that was intentional or not, it's slightly different than living down in the Twin Cities or things like that.
Yeah. Well, our viewers who live in the Twin Cities know all about how blue it is down there, and then sometimes red when it's on fire. But to hop into some of your recent articles, I was just reading a piece that you wrote, I think about a week or 2 ago, and you have a line in there that I want to ask you about. You write, "It's not necessarily about owning libs, it's about cogent messaging. The GOP doesn't need to rebrand, they need to run strong men and women who don't say or do silly things." I think on its face, this is a fantastic idea. We should run strong candidates and, kind of transcend social media moments into actual victory. But can you explain what that cogent messaging is? Because I think that's something that a lot of people, myself included, are sort of fishing for right now. What should the message of the GOP be?
Well, I think, cogent sometimes could be in the eye of the beholder. I mean, some people are going to find messaging that's right on target, conservative values to be appealing, and some might be more inclined to look for populism or fighting, and entertaining. But we've seen in the past with the Republican Party in the last, I'd say almost a decade, going back to 2012, where we ran some candidates, Todd Akin in Missouri, Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, people around the country in deep red states, not Delaware, but Missouri, Indiana, and Alabama just a couple of years ago with Roy Moore, who, whether or not their message was cogent, they made some errors along the way, whether it was their past or their present. And you got to do, kind of do scouting, you might call it, or recruiting, and find people that are basically good for their district, if it's a congressional district, or good for their state, if it's a Senate seat, obviously. So you avoid nominating people who have major shortcomings. And that starts in primaries. Well, it starts before the primary with recruitment. And I think McConnell did a good job cleaning that up in 2014 after the 2012 problems, and again in 2016 and 18. Last year, a mix, I'd say. And McCarthy is trying that in the House, and Paul Ryan before that had success and not some failures as well. But cogent messaging only works so far as the voters want to hear it. And I think we're sometimes in a different point in the country and in the Republican Party. So you gotta basically accommodate your voters. And so that means what might work in upstate New York for a Republican is not going to work in Southern Alabama. Although sometimes Southern Alabama doesn't work no matter what, going back to Roy Moore. So it's complicated. I think there are people obviously much wiser than I am who have been around longer that know this, but at the same time, I think it's doable. And we've seen the party do it. Really 2014, 16, and 18 were all successes at the congressional level.
Absolutely.
Or not 2018 at the House level, but.
Yeah. For our viewers who are just tuning in, we're on the line right now with A.J. Kaufman, published author, journalist, Minnesota-based. He writes commentary for Alpha News. You mentioned this word entertaining, and this is something I've seen frequently in your writing. Just yesterday, you published an article, Paul Ryan Talks Capitalism and the Entertainment Wing. I haven't heard people use the word entertaining in this context before. Describe what you're doing.
Yeah, Paul Ryan, who I generally admire as a conservative. I mean, you can criticize his leadership. He didn't want to be Speaker of the House. I think we all know that. It kind of came upon him when John Boehner left fairly abruptly. And then I believe Kevin McCarthy was next in line, but didn't have the votes. So Ryan took that. I think Ryan, if you think about him, is really a policy guy. He was, the left abhorred him as he was the most conservative guy around when he was Romney's VP and he was doing entitlement reform. And you remember the throw granny from the Cliff ads, that was all aimed at Paul Ryan. But he wound up being in leadership and, for better or worse, that pretty much ended his political career, at least for now. And I think what Ryan has been saying, and I'm sure others have said this too, it's a different world we live in 2021 than it was even in 2014 or 15. And a lot of people can get famous really fast in Congress, Senate, and the House. We don't need to name names, but there are people that are first termers that are on TV every night, seemingly. Certainly they have their own podcast and their names, whereas there are people that are around 20, 30 years. Everyone knows who the senator from, everyone knows Ben Sass, let's just say, in Nebraska. But do you know the other senator in Nebraska? Deb Fischer. She's been around longer than Ben Sass. So the point is, digital platforms like cable news and talk radio and social media are enable these guys and gals to rise up I think Ryan used the word meritocracy, but I would just say the latter, quicker than usual. And that can be good. We saw it with Donald Trump, obviously. We've seen it with, Josh Hawley, who I know we have a lot of fans of Josh Hawley that read our website. And we've seen it with Ted Cruz, and we've seen it with, I guess, Rand Paul, Marco Rubio, and so on, and maybe Tim Scott. But getting famous really fast and getting sometimes overexposed can be harmful if you have a flub here or there. And that can cause, people, when you run for an election, people will say, oh, isn't he the guy who blank? Marco Rubio drank water during a State of the Union rebuttal 9 years ago. And people still say, oh, Marco Rubio, the guy who drank water. Like that's really important.
But is that necessarily a consequence of getting famous quickly, or is that just a consequence of really conniving journalists that are good at writing hit pieces and picking out one moment and making it viral?
Oh, the latter for sure on that example. But if you go on a cable news show every other night, there's a chance you're gonna get popular. But at the same time, yes, conniving journalists will find something they don't like about you, and it isn't even always about policy.
Right.
Josh Hawley is very different than Ben Sass,
Yeah.
But they're both probably hated by the left for similar reasons, because they're outspoken and they're fighting for what they believe in, and and obviously different opinions. But I think temperament's important, and I think that policy and principles are. But I also think that if you're going to fight, and that's the word we hear a lot, fighting within your party, yelling rhino at your colleagues, not always the best thing. I think legislating and persuading people is probably better.
Not to be overly confrontational here, but you, Minnesota nice, right? But you just got done saying how we need to find candidates that resonate with the individuals that they're, supposed to be representing. Isn't that what a good portion of the Republican Party wants, is rooting out the rhinos? They want people that are going to get in there, ruffle some feathers, and find those people that have been in for 30 years and haven't made a name for themselves, and force them to be better.
Yeah, it depends where. I don't think that, in the suburbs of DC or Richmond, Virginia, where there maybe an educated, more affluent, more moderate Republican suburban district is the same as Western Nebraska or Northern Minnesota. So it just depends. Josh Hawley can get away with things probably in Missouri, and Ted Cruz can get away with things in Texas, and Ben Sass can get away with things in Nebraska that probably Marco Rubio maybe can't get away with in Florida, or of course, if someone's running in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Michigan. Like I think Rob Portman and Pat Toomey, who are both retiring, Ohio and Pennsylvania, they're probably more centrist than I'd care for. But for their states, it's disappointing they're retiring, because I think they're both good senators for their states who would have been reelected, whereas I don't know who we're going to run in those states that has a chance to win, because Pennsylvania is a slightly blue state, and Ohio, well, it's moving red, is still a state that Barack Obama won twice. It has a Democrat senator, Sherrod Brown. So I think it just depends. I think And yelling rhino, we're picking on the word rhino, but I don't, it's just a funny word, first of all, like rhino hunting, like rhinoceros or what? I mean, the whole idea of rhino or dino on the other side, it just depends. I mean, you have people out there who are more populist Republicans who really don't like the Republican Party, you might say, that are calling people rhinos. And I'm like, well, if you don't like the Republican Party, then shouldn't a rhino be something you're proud of? You know what I'm saying? Sometimes there's a conflict there with the word rhino, but I don't think we need to get into a long description of the word.
I think what a lot of those people are doing when they're calling somebody a rhino, they don't like the Republican Party because the rhinos have perverted it. They like what the Republican Party might have stood for previously. They like what the core values should be. And when they're calling somebody a rhino, they're not necessarily saying that, I don't like the Republican Party. Well, let me paraphrase. I don't think that being anti-establishment voids your right to criticize the establishment, as you're suggesting.
You don't think being anti-establishment, I missed a word there.
I don't think that being anti-establishment voids your right to criticize the establishment.
No, it doesn't. But it's again, populism. It's about saying things that are popular, that get people excited, right? I think
which wins elections. I mean, look at Donald Trump. He had massive support throughout his presidency from Republicans. I mean, the base absolutely loved him.
Well,
and
after a while,
he was rhino hunting the entire time.
Even though he was never really a Republican, he was criticizing the party. I know what you're saying.
Exactly, but that's what people voted for. That's what people are hungry for.
Well, people in the Republican Party?
Yes, that's what the base wants. And if we're going to have candidates that but satisfy the base, we need to adapt a little bit.
Depends. He didn't win in 2020, just saying. So you want to win the general election too. And we lost the House and the Senate again.
Well, there could be various causes of Trump's loss there.
But I don't want to get into tit for tat, but I think fighting really means understanding legislation, persuading people. Now, if fighting persuades people, that's great. And finding the right candidates for the districts that they are, rigorous recruitment, but going out there and I'll pick on Ted Cruz because Ted Cruz I used to like, but I found him a little bit off-putting now. He's always out there saying those DC leaders aren't fighting for you, but I am. Well, toward what? Who can be more outrageous and lob some insane expectations that never come to fruition, like his fight for Obamacare? That kind of stuff doesn't help the party. We lost seats because of that. So it's a delicate situation, and running for president is certainly different than running for senator, and running for senator is different than a district. When you get to congressional districts, I mean, as you know, where you guys are down in the suburbs of the Twin Cities, you're probably not going to run the same candidate as you would in Minnesota 7 in Western Minnesota.
Of course, you have to adapt your candidates to your district. I understand that.
Well, I don't think a guy who's saying hunt rhinos in Minnetonka, I know people are watching this from all around the country, but in a upper middle class suburb of Minnesota that's probably mixed at best, or maybe even leans a little left, that's probably not going to work. Whereas out in Worthington, Minnesota, or in Granite Falls or something, it would work better. So that's all I'm saying.
But then what's wrong with Ted Cruz doing that?
Well, he's in Texas, so he can get away with it a little more. But Ted Cruz barely beat Beto O'Rourke. Some might say he's a strong candidate, but he's pretty much been vanquished from the whole Democrat Party because I think he had a pretty weak candidate, even though the guy was popular because he skateboarded and whatever. I think Ted Cruz would have to be careful if he ran up against a more likable Democrat. Sure. Yeah, I don't want to pick on Ted Cruz all day, but
then what happens as the rising tide in the country, I believe, is left wing. You have demographic shifts that are turning countries or states like Texas blue. So our Republicans are supposed to perpetually backpedal and become more and more moderate and tone down the rhetoric until they become what?
Depends where. I'm going to keep saying depends where because...
Let's use Texas.
Well, it depends where in Texas. Now, I've been to Texas a lot for work. Texas is a red state, but as you know, probably, El Paso's a deep blue city. Austin's a deep blue city. Dallas is deep blue. Houston's pretty blue. San Antonio's blue. The suburbs are mixed. And then when you get out to the rural areas or even cities like Amarillo and Lubbock, it's more conservative. So yeah, you can get away. If you're Louis Gohmert, representing East Texas, you can say whatever you want and you're going to win by 30 points. And that's well and good. He represents his district. If you're running in a swing district in Plano, just north of Dallas, in an area that, as you said, is probably moving a little bit blue, but it's still probably fairly conservative. I don't think you can say outlandish things. I don't think you can go on Fox News primetime and say outlandish things because they're going to come back to hurt you amongst undecided voters.
Well, then what happens, as we continue to import hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens across the border and legal immigrants across the border, every month, of course, we both probably share criticisms of the Biden regime's attempts to do this. But what happens as the demographic changes continue in Texas, and suddenly what starts in Austin is now in those more rural, deep red districts? Do we expect our candidates to perpetually backpedal, or might it be beneficial to take a stance and say those supposedly outrageous things like, we need to restrict immigration, we need to form a populist base?
Well, I think you're gonna get the people that are naturally conservative in those areas to vote for you anyway. But the new immigrants, if they're coming there, and look at the southern border last election, Republicans did pretty well on the southern border with Hispanics that were living in Texas. As you remember, there have been stats showing that there were counties that Republicans actually won, that they lost by 20 points last time, and congressmen who were reelected. And the Democrat reps down there are actually very moderate to conservative reps. They're the ones sounding the alarm. So Latinos, if you're talking about them, if you look at many polls, immigration is not even their top priority. They want good schools, they want a good economy, they want national security, they want law enforcement. So yeah, I think if you don't have to cater to them on every issue like immigration, but I also think that it depends where you are. If you're not going to win in Austin, in the city of Austin, but in the suburbs, it depends who moves there. And are you asking how to attract immigrants that come to Texas cities or Arizona cities to the Republican Party?
What I'm asking is, so you said earlier that the hard right base will always vote for whoever has the R behind their name. I agree with that. They will. But what happens is you continue to dilute what that R means. I mean, they're always going to vote for the conservative candidate because it's better than the liberal. But as the candidate continues to soften and become more and more left-wing, are they even a conservative anymore? And if you continue to cater your candidates to the district, but the districts are moving more liberal, you're just going to be catering more and more liberal candidates. What's the point?
Yeah, certain districts are going to be a loss. I think you're right. I think there are places that Republicans used to win that they're not going to win anymore.
Northern Virginia. What happens in 20 years when that place is Texas? I mean, I don't
think it can spread that far. I also know that now. Don't forget, there's a misnomer that a lot of people talk about Texas and Florida and elsewhere. There's Californians moving there, and there's New Yorkers. A lot of the people, and I think you know this, Kyle, and probably our listeners do, a lot of people that left California, including my parents who moved to Arizona, are conservatives. They're not, it's not the liberals per se that are moving from California to Idaho or Arizona or Colorado, or the New Yorkers that are moving to Florida or Georgia. Yes, there are some that are, some retirees and such, but the average 40-year-old with a wife and 2 kids who's getting bankrupted by California policies or Minnesota policies or New York policies that moves to Texas or Georgia, Arizona, those people actually are conservative voters. So I don't think it's that bad. There were stats that I saw that said that, getting back to Ted Cruz actually did better amongst non-native born Texans than Beto O'Rourke. So he was getting people that had moved there. Whereas the native born Texans who are younger, I suppose, the 30-year-old, more liberal types were voting for Beto. So I don't think that the movement from within the country, from, Californians to Texas and so on, is the worst thing for a state like Texas, if we're going to talk about that.
I'm not necessarily worried about people moving from California to Texas. I'm worried about people moving from outside America to Texas. But I understand what you're saying. I think we just have a difference of agreement on our forecast of Texas.
Well, there's no denying Texas is turning blue. But I think it's
right. And if Texas is going to continue turning blue, and you're going to continue running candidates that cater to their districts, but you're not even going to be running Republicans anymore.
Well, depends.
You're going to be running liberals.
No, you weren't, because John Cornyn won there by 12 points, and he's not a far right-wing guy. He's a senator. He won easily last time. I think the reports of Texas turning blue, while there's merit to them, they're a little overblown. I don't think it's happening in the next multiple election cycles. I think John Cornyn won. I think we took back a couple of seats in the suburbs last time, even though obviously there are some seats that we lost before that. It's a slow process. Arizona, on the other hand, may be a different story, but that depends on the candidate. And now we can end with this. Martha McSally lost both seats in Arizona in 2 years, in both Senate seats. That's not good. And she didn't know what she stood for, though. One day she was hanging out with Trump and MAGA, MAGA, MAGA. Another day she was saying the opposite. So you have to be consistent too.
I mean, here's my concern. Everyone always says that, conservatism is standing in front of the freight train that is history and screaming stop. Yeah. You're not going to do it. And I think that's probably correct. And I'm afraid of that. And I think that perhaps the new populist movement that you see in the right wing is the way to build your own train going the other direction. Maybe it's time to stop asking the train to stop and pandering to, what the train tracks want, and start building your own train, build your own forward movement. That's my
if they can persuade people on policy, that'd be great. And don't say crazy things. Getting back to the beginning, don't say crazy things that they're going to be held against you, because the average voter who doesn't know much is sort of apathetic, who's thinking about who to vote for, and they hear that Jimmy Smith said blank on Sean Hannity's show a year ago, even though they probably shouldn't, they might switch their vote because of that. That's all.
Do you think the media is ever going to honestly report what conservatives are really saying, or do you think that anything you say is going to become a crazy thing?
Well, I think
look at it in the last 5 years. We've gone from hotly debating LGBT marriage to openly talking about maybe we should sex transition kids. I mean, the Overton window of what's crazy keeps moving, and it keeps moving to the left. And you see
that's
the same left-wing points become more and more normal, while as mainstream right-wing talking points that would have been innocuous, in the 90s are now considered fascist.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's a slippery slope that I've talked about, a domino effect, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to, the left won the gay marriage battle so quickly through the courts, mostly, not through voting, that they can move on to the next thing, whether it's transgender,
exactly.
father-daughter.
I've seen you write about this.
I have. I guess I have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I agree with you, but we've thoroughly dissected the GOP stuff. I appreciate you coming along for that little ride with me. That was very enjoyable. I think we should move now to your assessment of the left, because we've punched right far long enough. The Biden administration, absolutely crazy. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts, specifically as they pertain to Harris, who just received another responsibility after failing at the border.
Yeah, I've written a lot about Kamala Harris. It's easy to write about Kamala Harris. I was talking about her. Heck, I think I might have been talking about her early. Well, I was writing about her in her early Senate career, though not for Alpha News, because from the beginning she was crazy. She was asking General Mattis about climate change issues and things like that in the hearing, and then we saw her in the Supreme Court era where she was just, frankly, smug. That's the best word that comes to mind. And of course, in the most recent hearing, she was the only senator who sat in her office and didn't even come into the chamber to talk to Amy Coney Barrett. Right. So much for feminism, right? And of course, we know she was picked for a reason as vice president. Biden promised he'd pick a woman. I believe he promised he'd pick a woman of color, though there's some debate whether he actually said that. I think he did. Mm-hmm. I wrote about this. I mean, I would have picked, if you had to pick a woman of color, which I never would have promised, because you're eliminating like 80% of the country or 80% of Democrats by doing that. Amy Klobuchar may think that's great. She said, I'm out of this because I'm a white lady. That was really pitiful of her. Yeah. He had better options. And I'm not talking about Stacey Abrams, speaking of conspiracies, but he had Val Demings, who's running for Senate against Rubio in Florida now, who's a former police chief. He had Keisha Bottoms, who was the mayor of Atlanta. These are people that are way left of where I would be, but I think would have been a better choice. But he picked Harris as the safe choice. They kind of hid her on the campaign trail, which is pretty interesting. I guess Biden kind of hid too, but she was not exactly out there every day. They took her off TV ads, and her polling was terrible. It's always been terrible. She was a candidate that, if she wasn't the first to declare for the presidency, she was the second. She had 25,000 people at her first event, and I thought she was going to be the nominee. Full disclosure, I said, the media liked her. Half African American, half Asian, female, California, whatever, and she was a disaster, as you recall.
Yeah.
Didn't even make it to Iowa. I mean, she
had less than 1% of Democrats.
Yeah, she had to drop out in December. I mean, she's 2 months before Iowa. I mean, Pete Buttigieg leapfrogged her. Klobuchar leapfrogged her. Yeah. Biden obviously did. And she was in first place after that first debate, and she fell apart because she's not likable. No. She's not honest. And really, people don't trust her. And the problem for her is she's out of her sorts with this job. And Biden, for some reason, says she's the best person to handle the border, which was laughable. Right. And now she's moving on to what's her new job today, in charge of voting rights or increasing voting?
Yeah. CNN headline from an hour and a half ago. Kamala Harris to lead Biden administrations on voting rights. The first sentence of the article is, President Joe Biden announced that Vice President Kamala Harris will lead his administration's efforts on voting rights in his speech Tuesday on the Tulsa race massacre in Oklahoma.
Set your DVRs. Boy, I tell you, we're still doing Tulsa. God, I mean, I've been to Tulsa. Tulsa is one of my favorite cities in America. Yeah. It's a very conservative city, but they're really milking the 100th anniversary. I don't remember this kind of 100th anniversary coverage for the World War I centennial.
Right, right. It's ridiculous. And I've seen a lot of debate over the exact historicity of these claims. You're a historian. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I wasn't prepared for the question, but I can tell you that
Sure.
Tulsa had a thriving Black community, like many cities in the South. Now, segregation is not something we should ever, be in favor of or accept. But there was a middle class, upper middle class, rich Black community in Tulsa. There were millionaires. They were in the Greenwood district. They were doing very well. And there were race riots. It was a terrible thing 100 years ago, and we know what's happened with the war on poverty ever since. But nonetheless, I've been to that Greenwood district. It's still pretty nice. They've gentrified it a little bit, but it's a trendy part near downtown. It's just interesting how much coverage it's getting. Let's say that. There's always a 100th anniversary of something we could talk about. Warren Harding died 100 years ago next week, for all I know. Not quite, but they're doing it for a reason. They're linking it to their legislation. They're linking it to race. They're linking it to equity, which I hope everyone knows is not the same as equality. In fact, it's almost calls the opposite of equality. And Harris, getting back to her, the reason I never liked her is she's kind of everything I dislike about politics. She's kind of an unholy combination of a transparent phony and a vehement authoritarian. So she's, I'm going to take the guns, I'm going to do this, I'm going to pass that. But at the same time, she doesn't really stand for anything. One day she's Kamala the cop, right? And the next day she's bailing out people in Minnesota through the fund. So she's sanctimonious. She was obviously I give the Democrat primary voters credit. I mean, she was very bad in those debates. She was slandering her opponents. She wasn't debating. She was focused on nonsense like, are you going to ban Trump from Twitter? Which even Liz Warren was like, I don't know. And she laughs. Well, we know she laughs about everything, but she used to laugh about the Constitution when they asked her about it. And she's disliked by everyone, libertarians, conservatives, and even the far left, who thinks that she's, was too tough on crime in the past or smoked marijuana and put people in jail for that. She seems to be everything wrong with American politics today, in my opinion. And she's failed, but hey, give her credit. She's failed upward at this point, right?
Yeah. If you're going to fail, you might as well fail big. But she's an exact example of what we were talking about earlier, where the media will anoint a winner, and it doesn't really matter what they say or what they do. I mean, she laughs at the Constitution. She waffles on her own identity every 3 seconds as it's convenient, and the media continues to prop her up.
Yeah, and don't forget, she was also barely elected in California in 2010, I want to say, as Attorney General. That's California. She's running against a Republican, and she barely won. I mean, California they haven't voted for a Republican for anything since Schwarzenegger. Right. Interesting story there. And certainly haven't voted for anyone for any higher office like Senate or Attorney General in longer than that. So I think the last Republican senator was like 30 years ago. It's not impressed. And I don't think she's not getting any better. Let's put it that way at her job.
Right. What do you make of the fact that we've been talking about Kamala? I think it's so interesting that when people want to talk about the Biden administration, they end up talking about Harris, because it seems like at this point, Biden's that story is written and closed. He's clearly, suffering from certain problems related with aging. He's not in the public eye very much. Well, Harris is out there actually meeting with foreign leaders and looks like sort of the future of that leadership.
It's Joe Biden's 78. He'll be 81 or 82 if he were to run again in 2020. So most people assume he's not going to run.
Do you think he'll run?
Not at this point. No, I don't, because they're grooming Harris. Right. And like I told you recently, on the one hand, I'd say, she's younger, she's a female minority, whatever. That's going to be a tougher opponent. But I don't know. I'm starting to think if Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee for the Democrats, Republicans probably have a better chance of winning, because she's not very popular. Joe Biden is relatively popular in the country, and not his policies probably. I mean, a few of them, but most of them are not. But as a person, he is kind of the opposite of Trump, where the policies were fairly popular, and as a person, he was never really popular broadly across the country. The Democrats may want to think about a third option. Biden's going to be 82, Harris is unlikable. They could probably find someone else, but I don't know if they're thinking about that. And as far as her hanging out with world leaders and such, I don't know how many times Mike Pence did that, maybe here and there. Certainly was qualified for as a congressman and a governor, and I think a good conservative. But man, I think she's just accumulating resume building accomplishments on her portfolio. She's looking to have political, I wouldn't even say victories, but political occurrences she can put on her resume when she runs for president again, which I'm sure she will. I mean, she hasn't left I mean, she's left DC, but she hasn't left the country. She hasn't gone to the Northern Triangle. She's addressing root causes, which, we all can talk about what the root causes are without having to talk to the leaders and travel there.
Right.
It's really problematic. I don't mind them giving her responsibility. I don't mind any vice president having it, but I'm not sure she's up to the task.
I love how you describe it as political occurrences, not victories, because that's what it is.
I don't know what else to say.
For politics,
yeah,
it's just things that happen. Look at like Biden eating ice cream. That was an occurrence that like CNN was touting as like some victory. Oh, he ate chocolate ice cream, but
he likes the ice cream. He likes the ice cream. He does.
I had a thought about Harris the other day, and I want to get your opinion on it just while we're on the subject. I think that if they do run Harris, the left and the rest of America will feel like they were Trojan horsed into having her as the candidate. They'll feel like maybe Biden was just a setup to get Harris running term 2, and they might actually feel betrayed at that point. Do you think that pushing it that far and running Harris instead of Biden 2 would be distrustful? Would that finally break the people's trust in the DNC?
I don't know how many Democrats feel that way. The question is how many independents do, and I'm sure conservatives would.
Yeah.
I think it's all condescending. I mean, from saying you're going to pick a woman of color to picking one to then some people still think Biden's going to resign during this term and let her be the first female president, which would be quite a slap in the face to women to have the first female president be someone who wasn't even elected. So yeah, it's possible, but man, it's just so condescending. I mean, it's unfortunate. And the Republicans, they made fun of Sarah Palin, but she did everything on her own as governor and came into the vice presidential realm out of nowhere and, performed pretty well overall on the campaign trail. But, Republicans have 3 or 4 females who will probably run for president next time who are there on their own merit, Kristi Noem, Nikki Haley, and so on. But the Democrats have to actually have someone be given the job or groomed for it. And the Trojan horse analogy is, I think, fairly appropriate here.
I don't want to dive back into GOP politics, but we're so primed for the question that I have to ask. Who do you think would do well running against Harris?
Against Harris specifically?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's a different question than running against Biden or running against
a
Democrat. I think Nikki Haley would be a good candidate because then you neutralize the female aspect. Not to mention she's a minority.
I don't think Nikki Haley would be a good candidate for anything, but this is just the conversation we had earlier.
Yeah. I think she was a very successful governor and very good at the UN. So I'll give you that. Whether or not she's likable enough, and likability is what wins elections. If you look at last 50 years, I could argue with you that the more likable candidate won every election, going back to 72. The more likable candidate.
But then we're back to the problem of what does the American public like? Because it seems like right now they like transgender children and black.
Right. I know.
Yeah.
I know. But Haley's actually been out in front of that quite a bit. I mean, she's now. But again, if I was running against Joe Biden, it might not be Nikki Haley.
Sure.
But
who would it be in the case of Biden?
Well, I think the flavor of the day is DeSantis. I like governors. He's a little bit. He's been very good during the COVID crisis. There's no doubt about it. But he's also made enemies. It's going to happen. So is Greg Abbott. I don't think Greg Abbott's running for president. But just like Kristi Noem, you're a good governor. You're outspoken. You're a conservative. You do things that are not popular in the mainstream media, you're going to make enemies. So I don't know if he'll have made too many enemies to be broadly electable, but I think he'd be a good president. I think Tom Cotton, by the way, all of a sudden, who's a young guy, not much older than I am, but was obviously proven to be, heroic and intrepid on his COVID discussions. He's a former Army captain. He's a Harvard grad. I think he's a good candidate against Biden in particular because he has military service. But I also do like governors better than senators, even though there are 2 or 3 senators I really think would be good candidates, including Tim Scott, by the way.
Won't it be weird in a couple of years when we're having this debate about, whoever the candidate ends up being, but they're debating and we're going to end up coming back to COVID, aren't we? Especially if it's somebody like DeSantis who has a record of managing the whole COVID situation. We're going to be sitting there 4 years out talking about COVID still. That's going to be so unusual.
Yeah, I don't know if voters will need to hear about that. I do think factually DeSantis his record would stand up to anybody's. Mm-hmm. So I think it's okay. But they're going to find people like the crazy lady I forget her name, who's been written about recently, lady who was saying he was lying and then turned out to be a fraud. They wrote about her. Some articles were written about her. Name escapes me all of a sudden.
Sure.
Kelly. Yeah, you can look it up. But the lady who's running against him now for governor, Nikki Fried, who declared, I think today or yesterday, she's going to do the same thing. And there's an appetite for that amongst 30 or 40% of the country. whether or not in Florida, where people have actually lived it, they're going to fall for that. I don't know. I mean, by the way, people like DeSantis and Rubio, who's up for re-election, they have to win re-election before they can even think about running for president. You know, if Marco Rubio or Ron DeSantis lose re-election, I guess they can still run, but I wouldn't see it at that point.
Right, because you kind of need that hard base in your home state to have a platform to launch off of. And
Florida's a great state to have that. I mean, that's you know, it's become more conservative, but it's still the one of the top swing states and the third most populous state in the country.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to find that lady's name for you while you're.
Sure.
Rebecca Jones. Look her up, folks. Rebekah. There's been a couple articles written about what a fraud she was in terms of a conspiratorial person who was attacking DeSantis from her position as someone who was involved in counting and the COVID records up. And she got exposed. And, you know, even the left, even even Joe Scarborough and the MSNBC crowd basically said this lady is a nut.
Very interesting. Bringing it back to Minnesota, when you're looking at Minnesota, you're going to be writing these commentary articles for Alpha News. How do you parse out what issue you want to address, and what is your eye on right now as a major issue here in this state?
You know, I write about things everywhere, international, national, and Minnesota. We have really good hard news at Alpha News, including yourself, and a few other reporters who really do cover the daily beat, whether it's crime, cultural issues.
Nobody's covering crime. I mean, we have a
we are
crime, exactly, and that's just not something you get in Minnesota. Is real candid look at crime, which is astonishing considering what the statistics are.
No, you're not going to get that. I mean, you'll get it here and there from the newspapers, but not like we are. And I think that's what makes our site different, unique, and a worthwhile read, because we are covering the crime. Sometimes every day there's something we cover, and certainly 80% of it I think is not being covered by the mainstream, corporate, legacy media, whatever you want to call it. The Red Star, Tribune, you know. So I don't write much about the crime because you guys can handle that. I've written about, you know, during the campaign, I wrote about the different districts and how that might go. Schools, obviously, is something I, as a former teacher, care about. The interesting dichotomy of, in this state, like most states, how the schools with the more powerful teachers unions in the major cities didn't open until very, very recently, or maybe even not fully at all. And it comes to the case of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Whereas in rural Minnesota, even more rural than where I am, like real rural Minnesota, they were open, you know, pretty much before Christmas, if not even back in October. And that goes with every state. I mean, you look at any state, whether it's Virginia, outside of like California, where it's just 100% teachers union control, but even in liberal states like Virginia and New York, in the smaller towns, they're going to open. So yeah, I think the cultural divide in the state is real. It's as big as any state I've lived in, you know, between the Twin Cities and the rest of the state, for the most part, with a couple pockets, you know, Duluth and elsewhere. And I like to look at that. And as far as other articles, you know, I'm always looking to write about just kind of elections and campaigns. There's a primary tonight, not a primary, special election tonight in New Mexico in the 1st district, which was represented by Deb Holland, Minnesota connection. Her father was from New London, Minnesota, which is not far from, this is central Minnesota, small town. Her mother's Native American, so she's Native American, and she makes sure that she promotes that over half her family. She was chosen as Secretary of the Interior under Biden, and a very, very left-wing lady. You know, for a state like New Mexico that's run on oil and gas, she's about as left-wing as you get. She's, in my opinion, she's terrible for a state because she believes in the opposite of what her state does. But anyway, her seat's it's a Democrat-leaning district, but you know, Democrats didn't do that well in New Mexico even in last year. The 3rd district, the Southern district, flipped from Democrat to Republican. So there's some hope by Republicans about flipping that seat tonight. I don't think it's going to happen because Biden beat Trump by about 22, 23 points there. So it's going to be hard to flip it. It's Albuquerque, basically the big city. But nonetheless, I'm following that, and I'll have an article about that late tonight or early tomorrow, because if the Republicans win, that's another seat.
Absolutely. I really admire people like you that can get into that hard electoral reporting. I've never really been able to do it, you know, all the numbers and following the polls and tracking percentage points. Not so much my beat, but, you know, guys like you do a fantastic job covering that stuff.
Well, thanks. I like to travel. So I like that. With that becomes a joy of geography and places. So I think that also helps learning about different places.
Absolutely. You got to be in touch because America's got a lot of different cultures and textures across the nation. And
it does. Textures. It does have a lot of different textures. I like that. The fabric.
Yeah. I stole that from somebody. I didn't come up with it, but
it's good. Yeah.
We've been going for quite a while now. We've covered a broad variety of topics. Really appreciated sort of the diversity, to use a liberal word, of topics tonight. If there's anything you want to leave us with to sort of sum it all up as we come up on our usual half-hour mark, what would that be?
But do we have any questions? I'm just curious. Were there any questions from the crowd?
Sure. I don't see any in my chat. I'm sure there's some in the Facebook chat, but I never look at that. I don't see any in my chat immediately. So
okay.
No.
Okay. What else? Let's see. I think the Biden administration has a problem at the border. I don't think I'm breaking any news there, but I feel like that's the one issue. When you look at the polls for Biden, he does pretty well on COVID because, well, he inherited Operation Warp Speed, and he kind of lowballed how many doses he would be get going with the vaccine. And then he's, July 4th, we're going to open up. Well, we did it Memorial Day. We all knew it would be Memorial Day. Yeah. So he's getting credit for that, but he's going to get high grades on that. But he's gotten low grades on the immigration issue. And the fact that Kamala Harris was border czar in 81 days and she's not had a press conference, much less been there. He's created a lot of instability there. And the Democrats can talk all they want about numbers and say that Trump this and Trump that. There was no border crisis, so far as I know, when he took office. Now, maybe it was the time of the year, but there wasn't. The instability that's occurred now is because they knew there's a new administration. Mm-hmm. They know that crossing illegally will be punished very little, if not rewarded. And House Democrats don't want to deal with this. They don't want any reform on it. They're going to push party line bills that will loosen existing restrictions. And obviously, it's not a focus for Democrats. Never has been. Well, obviously, they want voters, I think, part of it. And I also think that they're just not in security as much as the Republicans are. That goes for foreign policy, too. But I think also it's important to note, culturally, Southern Texas is an area that's pretty rural, farm-oriented. And if you're living in Northern Virginia or working in D.C. or Manhattan or Chicago or L.A. or San Francisco, you might have your homeless issues, you might have your crime issues, but in their worldview, the border is not a big deal, sitting in air conditioning in a big city. So their social justice can basically overcome any concern, and they can use their social justice to kind of masquerade as caring. And I think it's really unfortunate. And I think that would be the main issue that might drag Biden down and the Democrats, because, economics, that you can always blame one side or the other, even though I think it's clear that, inflation is coming because of the policies of free money. Foreign policy, whether he handled the Israeli-Hamas crisis well, or Russia or China, people are going to differ. Tariffs, things like that, people are going to differ. But border security is a problem for them. And the polls show that 35% approval or something on that, as opposed to around 50, and a lot of other issues are higher. Yeah, absolutely. All things to monitor very closely. It'd take us probably 5 hours to get through all those issues in depth, but I think we sort of fired a shotgun and covered a broad variety of topics. I appreciate it very much. If people want to follow your work, read your articles, where can they do that? No social media here for me. Really? You're not on Twitter? No, not Twitter. No. I follow a lot of good people on Twitter to get information, including Kyle Hooten. And many other good writers and thinkers, but no social media. I have a LinkedIn account where I post some articles. That's very exciting, I know. alphanewsmn.com or alphanews.org. And, my articles are just about every day. I'm writing one, at least 5 or 6 a week, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And they can go there to find them. And I think you'll see a variety of topics. And I think the voice that I'm giving on most issues is a little different sometimes than others. And as the main columnist for the website, that's where you're going to find your opinion pieces. And for the news pieces, you've got Kyle, and you've got Anthony, and you've got Katie and Rose. So you've got plenty of people. Absolutely. Well, I'll second that. That's a good way to round out the show. Go to alphanews.com, read the articles, read the commentary, keep up on what's happening in Minnesota, because not very many outlets are giving it a candid look. And with that, thank you, AJ, for being with us tonight on the stream. And to our viewers, thanks for tuning in. Have a good night, and God bless. All right. Thank you.